Hi everyone, this is Miss Lasar, and today I'm going to be teaching you about cell structures and specialized cells. This lecture will be in outline format. You know what that looks like. So your notes will look something like this when you're done. Keep doing what you've always been doing, pausing the video as you go so that you can take complete notes. What do you write down? Everything that's in black. What's optional? The things that are in blue. Make sure your numbers and letters are vertically aligned. I want to see some beautiful tabbed in notes so that you can easily tell what information goes in each section. The things that are in blue, again, are interesting facts that are optional to write down. Let's get started. Before we start writing things down, I want to show you something. The scale, the size of cells. How small are they? You don't need to write anything from this section down. Just notice right here, I'm at the scale of a coffee bean and a grain of rice. I'm going to start zooming into this model. Now I can see a sesame seed. You know roughly what that size is, so keep that in mind as we keep zooming in. Here's our largest cell that's finally visible. This is an amoeba, which is a single-celled organism. It's made of one cell, one giant cell, and those giant cells are a little bit bigger than our human cells. Here you can start seeing the average human cell size. This is a skin cell. This is the largest human cell right here, the egg cell. And look, you can see the tiny sperm right there. So already notice how small we are. As I zoom out and the grain of salt comes back into view, notice how tiny the skin cell and the invisible sperm cell are already. Zooming back in, I can see more animal cells like the photoreceptor, which is in your eye. I can see the red blood cell. I can see a piece of DNA, the X chromosome that's inside all cells with a nucleus. Baker's yeast, this is now a single-celled organism. This is a less complex cell than an animal cell, and it's a single-celled organism. It's a fungus. Here's a cell part called a mitochondrion. That's single. Mitochondria is plural, the powerhouse of the cell. And notice here's a bacterial cell. Notice how much smaller the bacteria and the fungal cells were than the animal cells. Here's our smallest animal cell, the red blood cell, and that's a lot bigger than this bacteria. I'm going to keep zooming in, keep zooming in. I see more cell parts. That's a lysosome. And now I can see even smaller than the cell parts are viruses. So our viruses are much, much, much smaller than cells. They're not even cells. They're just packets of molecules packed together. And as I keep zooming in, I'll see more molecules. I'll see antibodies that might stick to a virus. I see a ribosome, which we'll come back to. Notice this is a large molecule, but it's still a molecule. It's really small. I see hemoglobin, which is in our red blood cells. I see phospholipids, which make up our cell membranes. And now I see individual atoms, and that's about as small as we're going to go. And there's glucose, which is a molecule made of multiple atoms. So zooming back out, our atoms are too small to see now. I see large molecules. Instead, I can see my viruses now. Molecules are out of sight. Now I'm seeing my cell parts, bacteria cells and fungal cells that are small. I'm seeing our larger animal cells now, our skin cell, which is our representative animal cell size, our large single-celled organisms like an amoeba and a paramecium. There's our grain of salt. There's our sesame seed, our coffee bean, and our grain of rice. And we're back to the beginning. Okay, so with that scale in mind, let's learn some of the details. And now we're going to start writing stuff down. Our first section, section A, is types of cells. And there's two main types. Type 1 is a eukaryotic cell. This is a vocabulary term. It's in bold on my slides. Underline it, highlight it, do something to make it stand out on your paper. A eukaryotic cell is a cell that contains organelles. You can see a picture, a cartoon really, of one here, and those organelles are all of the little things inside of it. I see mitochondria, I see a nucleus, I see an endoplasmic reticulum. These are the large cells, animal cells, plant cells, protist and fungi cells, all the big cells. These are all eukaryotic cells. So red blood cells, skin cells, all of our cells, and then also those big single-celled organisms like the amoeba, that's a protist. Those are all eukaryotic cells, and they contain organelles. Our next category of cell are number 2, the prokaryotic cells. Make sure that your 2 is vertically aligned with the 1 that's on top of it, not all the way on the left of your paper. You want to make sure your notes are neatly organized. Prokaryotic cells are those tiny bacteria cells that we saw. They are smaller and less complex. They do not have organelles. They include bacteria. So here I've got a comparison between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell. This size is actually off. This prokaryotic cell should be much, much smaller than this eukaryotic cell. So this is zoomed in right now. Think about the size of the skin cell versus the size of the E. coli bacteria cell. The E. coli bacteria cell was much smaller. And notice it's much less complex in the inside. It doesn't have any organelles. There's no nucleus. There's no mitochondria. We'll talk more about those cell parts momentarily. Section B, cell structure. So make sure your B is vertically aligned with your A. And in section B are cell structures. Let's start with structure 1, the cell membrane. Here's an image of it. The cell membrane is a thin, flexible layer that's around all cells, prokaryotic, eukaryotic, no matter the size, there is a cell membrane around the outside. This cell membrane is made of lipids. Remember, those are fats. And that's important because that actually means that it's a watertight barrier. Water is not going to rush out or rush into the cell. It's going to keep everything enclosed nicely. Detail B, some very small molecules can pass through the cell membrane, but most things cannot. Our second cell structure is our cell wall. So we just had the cell membrane, now we have the cell wall. The cell wall is a thick, rigid layer around some cells that provides structural support. The cell membrane, you saw it in that moving image, was thin, it was flexible. The cell wall is not. It is thick and it is very, very rigid. It is not found around all cells. It is found around all plant cells and most bacteria cells, but notice it is not found around animal cells, and that's what keeps you flexible and keeps your tissues flexible. Detail B, the cell wall is made of cellulose. You've heard this term before. It's actually in your notes from biological molecules. Cellulose is a carbohydrate polymer. So it's a carbohydrate polymer that's made of multiple glucose monomers bonded together into a long chain. It's also the outermost layer. If you ever see a diagram of, say, a plant cell, the outermost layer around the exterior of the cell will be the cell wall. Think about this as the strong outer walls of a building. Structure 3 is the cytoplasm. And this isn't so much a structure as a space. The cytoplasm is the jelly-like liquid that fills the spaces within all cells. This is what we think of as the quote-unquote empty space on the interior of cells, except it's not empty. I want you to think of it as a fluid, as a liquid. It's a mixture of water, of proteins, and lots of other small molecules. This is in blue, so it's optional to write down, but if this is helpful to you, consider adding it to your notes. The cytoplasm is important because that's where most chemical reactions happen. That's where most chain of events, this molecule turns into this molecule, this enzyme builds this other molecule. All of those chemical reactions are happening in the space in between the organelles. What we think of as empty space, that's not actually empty, the cytoplasm of the cell. Now let's focus in on our first organelle. You can see it indicated here in these. This is skin tissue from an animal that we're looking at. Structure 4, the nucleus. The nucleus is an organelle that controls and regulates cell function, and most importantly, it contains DNA. I've highlighted organelle, and I've put a little note in blue here. Be sure to make note of which structures are organelles as you go. Circle this word, underline it, highlight it, do something so that when you look back at your notes, you can tell which of these cell structures are organelles. Remember, who has organelles? Eukaryotic cells. Who doesn't have organelles? Prokaryotic cells. So you actually need to be able to note quickly, will a prokaryotic cell have this structure or not have this structure? And you could tell that a prokaryotic cell would not have this structure because it's an organelle. They still have DNA, it's just not contained within a nucleus. Our fifth structure is the mitochondria, and that's plural. Mitochondrion is the singular, so one mitochondrion, many mitochondria. The mitochondria or mitochondrion is an organelle, again, note it, where cellular respiration takes place and ATP is made. You've learned about this process previously. This is the powerhouse of the cell. Prokaryotes still do cellular respiration. They just do it less efficiently because they don't have mitochondria. You'll learn in AP biology how cellular respiration actually takes place in the mitochondria and how this nice little structure allows cellular respiration to take place so efficiently. Remember, cellular respiration, if you've forgotten, is the process where oxygen and glucose are broken apart, and the released energy is used to build ATP, which is the energy currency of all cells. Our sixth structure, you can see an image of it here, is the ribosome. The ribosome is a structure that all cells use to build protein. So this is not an organelle. All cells have them. And you can see it here actually scanning down an RNA strand and building a protein. This process, protein synthesis, is something that we'll learn about in the next couple of weeks. Ribosomes are tiny. They're really just large molecules. You saw them in our cell scale model at the beginning of this video. They are way smaller than all of the organelles. Our seventh structure is a chloroplast, and this is an organelle. It's only found in plant cells, and it's only found in plant cells where photosynthesis happens. So plant cells that are exposed to light and actively doing photosynthesis. Remember, photosynthesis, which you've learned about previously, is the process where carbon dioxide and water are rearranged into glucose, and that glucose stores lots of energy. We also make oxygen. That's a waste product. And we only do this in the presence of sunlight. You can actually see the chloroplasts in these cells. Each of these green circles that we can see under a microscope image, each green circle is a chloroplast. So notice how many chloroplasts are in each of these plant cells. Here's one cell, and we can see a couple dozen chloroplasts are within just that one cell. Our eighth structure is an interesting one called a vacuole. This is, again, an organelle, and it's where water and nutrients are stored. So take a look at these diagrams. We've got an animal cell here, a plant cell here. Vacuoles are common and large in plant cells. So here's what a vacuole would look like in a plant cell, one really big one. But they are rare and small in animal cells. So in an animal cell, a vacuole would be this small little guy, and we would have multiple tiny ones within an animal cell. They're much rarer in animal cells. They're much more common in plant cells. And that's because in plant cells, they're usually used to store water, which keeps the plant cell expanded and rigid and gives the plant some structure and strength. Our ninth structure is the endoplasmic reticulum. Practice saying that. It's really fun to say, the endoplasmic reticulum. This is an organelle where proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids are made or modified into their final form. And you'll actually be able to see the endoplasmic reticulum on most diagrams by looking for the nucleus, this circle with holes in it, that's actually the nucleus. And coming off of the nucleus is this stacked pancake structure attached to the nucleus. This is the endoplasmic reticulum. And happening in all of these folds and tubes is going to be the process of making molecules. We're going to be making proteins or carbohydrates or lipids. Any molecule that's being made is probably going to be made here. Our 10th structure is the Golgi apparatus. This is an organelle where molecules are packaged into small vesicles for transport out of the cell. This is our shipping center. It looks similar to the endoplasmic reticulum. It's this kind of stacked pancake form. But what's important is that bubbles bubble off of this Golgi complex or Golgi apparatus or Golgi body. There's a couple different names for this structure. These bubbles contain little dots. Those represent molecules. And those bubbles attach to the outside, the cell membrane of the cell, and they release all of those molecules into the outside of the cell. So if this was an endocrine cell making hormones, then the hormones would be packaged up in one of these bubbles in the Golgi apparatus. That bubble would be sent out to the cell membrane, the bubble would open up, and the hormones would be released to the outside of the cell. Our 11th structure is cilia. These are small hair-like projections on the surface of some cells. Not all cells have cilia. This is a specialized structure. This is in blue, it's optional. Cilia on lung cells move microbes and other debris up and out of the airways. You can actually see that happening right here. Notice how there's a flow going this way over this cell structure. These are many, many cells closely packed together with little tiny cilia at the top. Those cilia are brushing things this way to the left, and you can see that the movement of stuff is moving towards the left as it's pushed, clearing stuff out of, in this case, airways. Here is a single-celled organism. This is a paramecium, and it is covered in lots of tiny little cilia, and that's how it moves. Speaking of movement, structure 12 is the flagella. These are long tail-like projections on the surface of some cells that aid in locomotion and movement. Some bacteria and protist cells have these, and some animal cells have these. For example, sperm cells have these. Here we see sperm cells. You can see the main cell body and then the long flagella, the tail coming off of it that allows the sperm cell to move. Here is an image, a diagram of bacteria that have multiple flagella coming off of this end, but they also have a whole bunch of cilia around them. So we have a combo set of structures here, and this is going to help them direct their movement. Structure 13, one more movement structure, is a pseudopod. A pseudopod is a temporary mobile projection that allows cells to move along a surface. Amoebas use pseudopods to move. Here's an amoeba. You can see it extending this pseudopod, and it's actually going to, so it extends its pseudopod, and notice that this backside of it that's not extending pseudopods is flowing towards where the pseudopods are anchoring it. So each of these projections is an individual pseudopod that it's using to help move. White blood cells crawling to a wound site will also use pseudopods. Here's a white blood cell migrating in between red blood cells, and you can see it extending its pseudopod and then kind of pulling itself towards where the pseudopod is going. Our third section, section C, is specialized cells. Specialized cells are cells in a multicellular organism that have a specific form to allow them to perform a specific function. Contrast this with the unspecialized cells of a single-celled organism, where there's just one cell and it's got to do everything. It's got to have all parts and do all functions. In a multicellular organism, each cell can look a little different and do something a little different to perform a specific function. We're going to give you some examples in plant cells and animal cells. Section 1 in specialized cells is plant cell examples. And the first plant cell example is a leaf cell. Leaf cells are also sometimes called mesophyll cells. That is an optional term to write down. I should have put that in blue. Leaf cells have this specific function to perform photosynthesis. All right, notice how much tabbing we're doing here. Keep it organized so that this is easy to look back on in the future. Detail small I or small 1 under section small a is the function. The form of the leaf cell to help it perform this function is it has chloroplasts and vacuoles. Chloroplasts are where photosynthesis will actually take place. Vacuoles will help store the products of photosynthesis before they can get shipped out. There are hundreds of specialized cells in each organism, including in the human body, and plants also have a ton of different specialized cells as well. Our second plant cell example, so this is example small b, make sure this is vertically aligned with small a, are onion root tip cells. You can see them all organized here. There are hundreds of cells in this image. Notice the cell wall, the outer boundary of each of these plant cells, and the nucleus, which is this black dot. Each black dot is the nucleus inside one of these cells. Detail 1, the function of an onion root tip cell is to absorb water and minerals from the soil and to push through the soil. So what form does it have to help it do this function? Well, its form is no chloroplast. It's not going to spend energy making and maintaining chloroplast because it's not exposed to light. And these cells are also arranged into a point shape. so that they can burrow through the soil easily. Section 2 in specialized cell examples are the animal cell examples. Our first animal cell example is a red blood cell. These are also called erythrocytes. Erythrocytes. And the function of a red blood cell or erythrocyte is to pass through blood vessels to carry oxygen to all body cells. What's their form that supports this function? Well, their form, their shape is that they are small. They're the smallest animal cells. They're very, very flexible. They have a round shape to easily fit through capillaries, and they don't have a nucleus. As they're maturing, they actually discard their nucleus so that they are even smaller and can fit through capillaries even easier. Remember, red blood cells absorb oxygen from the lungs. They transport it to all of the cells, as well as carrying carbon dioxide back to the lungs to be excreted. And here you can see multiple red blood cells fitting through the tiniest blood vessel, a capillary. Our next type of animal cell is a nerve cell, otherwise known as a neuron. Its function is to transmit nerve impulses across long distances to and from the brain and throughout the body. Its form to support this function is being really long and thin, having wire-like projections. It's also wrapped in insulating myelin, just like an electrical wire is. Think about the rubber coating around the electrical wires around us. Your nerve cells have that same insulating coating. It's called myelin. Nerve cells also have lots of mitochondria because sending these electrical signals takes a lot of energy. Here's what tiny nerve cells in your brain look like. You can see their long projections, but nerve cells outside of your brain are much, much longer than this. The longest nerve in your body is the sciatic nerve, and it is a super long, thin nerve that goes all the way from the base of your spinal cord down to the end of your big toe. It's an incredibly long, thin cell. We can see that nerve cells have a main cell body, and most of them have one long extension coming off of them that's called the axon. That's an optional thing to write down. Our next animal cell example is a skeletal muscle cell. The function of skeletal muscle cells is to expand and contract repeatedly, and their form includes long protein fibers and lots of mitochondria. So take a look at our muscle cells here. The black dot represents a nucleus. It's a little hard to see the boundaries of the cells here. They're all kind of overlapping, and importantly, they're organized into these long fibers. These are muscle fibers made of multiple muscle cells. The striations, the stripes that you see going up and down, those are protein fibers that are within each cell, and that allows each cell to expand and contract repeatedly. Our next animal cell is a sperm cell. Its function is to swim long distances to an unfertilized egg to add its genetic material to the unfertilized egg. And its form is a small cell body with a long flagellum, that's a singular of flagella, and lots of mitochondria to power this extensive movement. Final section is diseases of cell structures, and I've got 3 that I'd like to tell you about. The first disease is called sickle cell anemia. Notice that this is all in blue. This is all optional to write down. There's a couple details of sickle cell anemia I'll have you write down, and you'll see those in black. Sickle cell anemia happens as a result of a genetic disease. So you have the genes that are a little bit faulty, a little bit mutated, that give you cells with sickle cell hemoglobin. Sickle cell hemoglobin cells are stiff, they are sticky. When they lose their oxygen, they form into the shape of a sickle or a crescent, like the letter C. So you can kind of see these sickle-shaped red blood cells here. These cells stick together, they can't easily move through blood vessels, and this can block small blood vessels and the movement of healthy, normal oxygen-carrying blood cells. These blockages can cause pain, and we're going to explore this disease a little bit more in class. Some things to write down and to know about sickle cell anemia. In sickle cell anemia, red blood cells are crescent-shaped. They're not circular anymore. These red blood cells get caught in capillaries. And again, we'll explore this more in class. The second disease is called mitochondrial disease. You can guess which part of the cell is impacted here. When mitochondria cannot convert food and oxygen into life sustaining energy or can't do it as efficiently, cell injury and even cell death follow. When this process is repeated throughout the body, organ systems begin to fail and even stop functioning. Cells with lots of mitochondria suffer the most. Think about what those are, what you just heard me mention. Those would be brain cells and muscle cells that require a lot of mitochondria to give them enough energy to survive and to do their jobs. Our third and final disease is motor neuron disease, for example, ALS. This is a large group of diseases in which the nerve cells, neurons, that control muscles undergo degeneration and die. Degeneration is kind of falling apart and losing their function. Notice in this image in ALS, this nerve cell loses a lot of its projections. These are called dendrites. And so that means it can't send signals to other nerve cells as well. The muscle that this nerve cell is attached to is going to lose its function. It might actually fall apart a little bit when it's not getting as many signals and it's not contracting as much. The muscle will atrophy, which means get a lot smaller. And an individual with ALS will have a much harder time moving this muscle and might actually lose the ability to lose this muscle. In motor neuron disease, nerve impulses don't get transmitted because the nerve cell is impacted and isn't able to do its function, sending those electrical signals. Damage to motor neurons leads to lack of muscle control because motor neurons are the things that allow your muscles to contract. That's our final disease and the final thing that we're going to be writing down. Stay tuned for more information about diseases, more practice with specialized cells, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.